Imagine finding a ship drifting alone in the middle of the Atlantic. Not a wreck, not a sinking ship. A perfectly recognizable merchant vessel still afloat and carrying its cargo. But there was one problem. There wasn't a single person on board. No captain, no crew, no passengers. 10 people had sailed aboard the ship. All 10 were gone, and nobody ever found out exactly what happened to them. The ship was called the Mary Celeste, and what happened to it in 1872 became one of the most famous mysteries in maritime history. On December 4, 1872, the crew of another ship spotted the Mary Celeste in the Atlantic. They were roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. From a distance, something immediately looked wrong. The ship wasn't being properly controlled. It was drifting and moving unpredictably through the rough sea. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia decided to investigate. He had no idea that he was about to find one of the strangest abandoned ships ever recorded. When his men finally reached the Mary Celeste, they climbed aboard, and what they found was deeply unsettling. The ship was still seaworthy. Its cargo was largely intact. There were supplies on board. There was food. There was water. But the people who were supposed to be using all of it were gone. The Mary Celeste wasn't some mysterious ghost ship built for an adventure story. It was an ordinary 19th-century merchant vessel. The ship had originally been built in Nova Scotia in 1861. At the time, it was called the Amazon. After a series of accidents and changes in ownership, the vessel was repaired and eventually renamed the Mary Celeste. By 1872, it was being used for transatlantic trade, and that year it was carrying a particularly important cargo, more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol. The destination was Genoa, Italy. Nothing about the voyage was supposed to be unusual. The captain was Benjamin Spooner Briggs. He wasn't an inexperienced sailor gambling on his first command. Briggs was an experienced and respected captain. And this particular voyage was also a family journey. His wife, Sarah, was aboard. So was their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. 7 other crew members completed the group, 10 people in total. They left New York on November 7, 1872. Their destination was Italy. They had no reason to believe that they would never reach it. The Atlantic did not make the voyage easy. The Mary Celeste encountered bad weather during the crossing. The sea was rough, the winds were strong, and for a sailing ship in the 19th century that could turn an ordinary journey into a dangerous one very quickly. The ship's log contains its last known entry on November 25th. At that point, the Mary Celeste was close to the Azores. More specifically, the final position placed the ship near the island of Santa Maria, and then the records stop. No final explanation. No message, no account of an emergency, just silence. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia entered the Mary Celeste, they found a ship that looked abandoned rather than destroyed. There were no bodies. There were no survivors. There was no obvious sign that pirates had attacked the vessel. And the ship itself was still capable of sailing, but it wasn't completely normal. The charts had been disturbed. Some equipment was out of place. One of the ship's pumps had been disassembled, and the only lifeboat was missing. That detail mattered, because if the crew had left voluntarily, the lifeboat was probably how they had done it. But why would an experienced captain abandon a seaworthy ship in the middle of the ocean? That was the question nobody could answer. The Mary Celeste was carrying 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. Most of that cargo was still there. That was important because it made one of the simplest explanations less convincing. If pirates had boarded the ship looking for valuable cargo, they had somehow left almost everything behind. If the crew had stolen the cargo themselves, they had also left it behind. And if everyone on board had simply decided to disappear, they had abandoned a ship containing months of supplies. The ship even had enough food and water to support the people aboard for a considerable period. Yet all 10 people were gone. The lifeboat was one of the most important clues. The Mary Celeste had been abandoned, but the crew hadn't simply vanished into thin air. At some point, the people aboard had gone from the ship to the lifeboat, and that meant something had convinced them that remaining on the Mary Celeste was more dangerous than entering a small boat in the Atlantic. That is a very important distinction, because the mystery isn't really, how did 10 people disappear? The more interesting question is, what could make an experienced captain order his entire family and crew into a lifeboat and leave a functioning ship behind? The Dei Gratia crew eventually brought the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar. There, British authorities began investigating what had happened. At first, investigators considered the possibility of foul play. Maybe the crew of the Mary Celeste had been murdered. Maybe there had been a mutiny. Maybe the Dei Gratia crew had attacked the abandoned ship and invented the story afterward. The investigation lasted for more than 3 months, but authorities couldn't find convincing evidence that the disappearance had been caused by a criminal act. The case remained unresolved, and that uncertainty was about to make the story famous. The lack of an answer created the perfect environment for speculation. Newspapers began publishing theories. Some suggested that alcohol had played a role. Others imagined mutiny, piracy, or murder. And as the story spread, the facts became mixed with increasingly dramatic inventions. The Mary Celeste stopped being simply a mysterious abandoned ship. It became a legend. Eventually, even famous writers joined in. In 1884, Arthur Conan Doyle published a fictional story inspired by the Mary Celeste. His version was far more dramatic than the historical evidence, but readers loved it. And stories like this helped transform the Mary Celeste from a real maritime mystery into a cultural myth. One of the most famous theories involved the ship's cargo. Remember what the Mary Celeste was carrying: industrial alcohol. The theory was that alcohol vapors might have accumulated inside the ship. If the crew believed the cargo was about to explode, they might have panicked and abandoned the vessel. It sounds plausible at first. But there are problems. The boarding party did not report finding the main hatch blown open. They also didn't report a strong smell of alcohol fumes, and most of the cargo was still intact. So while the alcohol theory became famous, it doesn't explain everything. There was, however, one strange detail. 9 of the 1,701 barrels were empty. That sounds important, but there is a catch. Those 9 barrels were made from red oak rather than the white oak used for most of the other barrels. Red oak is more porous. That means those particular barrels were more likely to leak. So the fact that 9 barrels were empty doesn't prove that an explosion occurred. It may simply mean that some alcohol had leaked during the voyage. And this is where the real investigation becomes more interesting than the legend. One modern investigation looked at something much less dramatic: navigation. The last recorded position of the Mary Celeste suggested that the ship was close to Santa Maria, but historical weather data and the ship's recorded course suggested something unusual. The captain may have believed he was much closer to land than he actually was. One possible explanation was an inaccurate chronometer, the instrument used to determine longitude. If Briggs believed the ship was approaching land, he may have expected to reach safety much sooner than he actually could. And then the situation got worse. The Mary Celeste had another problem. One of its pumps had been disassembled when the boarding party found the ship. Why? One possibility involves the ship's previous voyage. Before its final journey, the Mary Celeste had carried coal. Coal dust and construction debris may have contaminated the pumping system. If the pump wasn't functioning properly, Briggs couldn't easily determine how much water was accumulating inside the hull. And that matters because the ship was carrying a large cargo. From inside the vessel, a captain could potentially have a very difficult time determining whether the ship was slowly filling with water. Now put all the pieces together. Briggs is an experienced captain. His ship has just endured rough weather. His navigation may be less accurate than he believes. He is approaching the Azores. The ship's pump may not be working properly, and he may not know exactly how much water is inside the hull. Then, after a difficult night at sea, he finally sees land. Santa Maria, for a captain, that could change everything. If Briggs believed his ship was in danger, he didn't necessarily have to abandon it forever. He could order everyone into the lifeboat temporarily. Stay close to the ship, wait for conditions to improve, then return. At least, that may have been the plan. But there was a problem. If the ship was farther from Santa Maria than Briggs believed, the lifeboat could have been separated from the Mary Celeste. Once that happened, the situation would become catastrophic. The Mary Celeste was capable of continuing without its crew. A small lifeboat in the Atlantic was not nearly as forgiving. The ship could drift. The people in the lifeboat could disappear. And if nobody survived to explain what happened, the evidence would remain painfully incomplete. That is one of the reasons the mystery has survived for more than a century. So what do we actually know? We know that the Mary Celeste existed. We know that Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their daughter, and 7 crew members sailed aboard it. We know that the ship left New York in November of 1872. We know that its log stopped on November 25th. We know that the ship was found days later, roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. We know that the crew was gone, and we know that the lifeboat was missing. Everything beyond that becomes increasingly uncertain. We don't know the exact moment the crew abandoned the ship. We don't know exactly what Briggs believed was happening. We don't know whether he intended to return, and we don't know what happened to the 10 people after they left the Mary Celeste. No confirmed wreckage of their lifeboat was found. No member of the group ever returned, and there was no final testimony to explain the decision. That means there is no definitive solution, only competing explanations. For more than 150 years, people have tried to turn the Mary Celeste into a perfect mystery. A ghost ship, a murder scene, a pirate attack, a supernatural story. But the real story may be more unsettling precisely because it doesn't require anything supernatural. An experienced captain may have faced a confusing and dangerous situation. He may have believed his ship was in immediate danger. He may have made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, and then something went catastrophically wrong. The Mary Celeste continued drifting without the people who had sailed her. The ship survived, the cargo survived. The vessel eventually reached Gibraltar, but the 10 people who had boarded her in New York were never seen again. And that leaves us with one final question. What happened in those last moments aboard the Mary Celeste? We may never know, because the only people who could answer that question disappeared with the lifeboat, and the ship kept sailing without them.